Good morning. On behalf of the Philadelphia Commission for Women and the Mayor's Office of Engagement for Women, I welcome you to this morning's commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, when women earned the right to vote. And I use that word earned deliberately. The women's movement for the right to vote was filled with bold, brave, and dare I say, ambitious women who petitioned, who marched, who were jailed, and went on hunger strikes to achieve the right to vote. Here today, under the banner of Suffrage.Race.Power, we want to elevate the important role that Black women played not only for women's suffrage, but for universal suffrage. And to this extent, this year also marks the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, when Black men earned the right to vote. But as we know, Black people have always had to put an asterisk on these constitutional rights. Barriers, especially in the Jim Crow South, stood in the way of Black voters. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that Black and brown people gained some relief. Unfortunately, some of the provisions of these hard-fought gains have been gutted by the US Supreme Court. Even today, we are eyewitnesses to voter suppression schemes to keep Black and brown people from voting. Many of you registered for the Commission's 4th Annual Summit for Women and Girls that was scheduled for March. Then we were hit with the COVID-19 pandemic. We recognize the tragic loss many of you have faced, the loss of loved ones, the loss of income, and even the loss of being in the presence of one another.
Hello.
Please know that your loss is not taken lightly. As early as the summer of 2019, the Philadelphia Commission for Women signed on as a sister organization to the National Suffrage.Race.Power Civic Engagement Initiative to elevate the voices of Black women, not only women who were intentionally erased from the history of suffrage, but also the voices of Black women leaders of the past who are overlooked and underappreciated. Brainchild of Philadelphia's Gwen McKinney, I'd like to open up our program today with UnErased, a Black woman's love song, performed and narrated by Latasha Brown, a co-founder of Black Voters Matter. And many of you may remember Latasha for her inspiring keynotes at the Commission's 2018 and 2019 Summit for Women and Girls. May I present to you UnErased, a Black woman's love song.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, Sonia.
Yes, I'm here. I didn't want to, someone was talking, so I didn't want to say anything. I was just listening, but I wanted you to know I'm here, okay?
Thank you. We're queuing the video.
Hello?
100 suffrage and sorrow, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It's time to honor those erased from her story. It's time to rise and take our place. In this moment, we won't be erased. Time to rise, time to rise. Stand in our power today.
Black women are miracle workers.
Tell our story, how we offered our gifts without glory, through the pain and the fears, the trial and the tears, despite the veil
So it is with this love song an honor to have today's guests, the acclaimed authors of the book, They Carried Us, The Social Impact of Philadelphia's Black Women Leaders. Our moderator today is veteran broadcaster, journalist, filmmaker, and friend, Karen Warrington. I think it is also noteworthy that the book that Dr. Alinar M. Baker Rogers and Fasaha and Trayor have written is a love story to 95 of Philadelphia's Black women leaders that include book cover artist Barbara Bullock, poet laureate extraordinaire Sonia Sanchez, and today's moderator, my friend, my mentor, Karen Warrington. Thank you, Karen.
Well, thanks for joining us. The powerful video we've just used is especially fitting in this time of reckoning in America. As we speak, our nation is being forced to acknowledge systemic racism that remains a barrier to full and equal citizenship for Black, brown, and non-gender conforming folk. This reckoning comes as the nation is marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution that granted the right to vote to women. But that's a misnomer, because as we know and have not necessarily acknowledged, Black women were still disenfranchised because of the reality of American apple pie racism, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and actual laws that prevented the grandchildren of enslaved Black people from voting. In general, Black people, men and women, did not get the right to vote under the law until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So today, the Philadelphia Commission for Women is commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and Women's Equality Day by presenting what is named Suffrage.Race.Power, UnErased. This will be an enlarging of the conversation to include the role Black women had played as a part of the suffragette movement, but also their centuries-long participation and impact in both the voting rights and women's movements. Today, the Commission has assembled a distinguished panel to have as Dr. Janetta Cole, the former president of Bennett and Spelman Colleges, says, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment presents an opportunity to honestly, and I underscore honestly, examine the relationship between white and Black women in the women's rights movement. The conversation will directly focus on the recently released book, They Carried Us, The Social Impact of Philadelphia's Black Women Leaders by authors Dr. Alinar Baker Rogers and Fasaha Trayor. The book presents a collection of 95 largely hidden figure African-American women, beginning with our ancestor sister, Miss Alice, an enslaved woman born in Philadelphia in 1694. I repeat, in 1694. So joining us also is Professor Sonia Sanchez, as we lovingly call her Sister Sonia. She will read the foreword she has written in the book, They Carried Us. Of course, our sister is an award-winning poet, essayist, and educator who refers to herself as a Black feminist. She was a leading figure in the Black arts movement and a leader in the establishment of Black studies curriculum in higher ed. In 2001, she was awarded the Robert Frost Medal for her contribution to the canon of American poetry. Here in Philadelphia, she served as the city's first poet laureate from 2012 to 2014. In addition, she won the 2018 Wallace Stevens Award for Lifetime Achievement for the Academy of Poets. And last year, she won the Anna Fess Wolf Lifetime Achievement Award for understanding racism and the rich diversity of human culture. Our sister, Sonia.
Thank you so very much, Sister Karen, and to Sisters Hill and Sister Baker Rogers and Sister Trayor. It is an honor to be a part of this program today. The foreword I wrote says, as I read, the contents of this amazing book honoring Black women of Philadelphia, I am reminded of the time I met the great Cuban poet Nicolas Guillen. He was standing in the middle of his office, feet planted on Cuban earth, legs no longer strong, but arms strong like Elizabeth Catlett's Black women's arms. And he folded me into his arms and hugged me so hard that I felt that I could not breathe. And I thought, hold it, I did not come all the way just to die in Cuba. Then I realized that if I just stopped struggling and leaned into his breath, I would be all right. And I leaned into his breath, and we began to breathe as one. That is what our sisters in this book have taught me, the necessity to lean into each other's breath and breathe as one. So listen, 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 gentle persons. I come to praise these women who have what Fanon wrote, to hold themselves like a sliver to the heart of the world, to stand up to the world, to do battle for the creation of a human world that is a world of reciprocal recognition. These magical, dedicated women who helped us reconnoiter the wonder of our people. These women sequestered in the hurricane of Pennsylvania and American history spoke and walked in thunder. They rescued us from northern subscriptions of death. They taught us that the enemy is not a few men or women, but a system. They taught us all that vengeance is not the point. Change is, education is, work is, organizing is, history is, respect is, freedom is, social and sexual and racial and economic justice is, love is, and we must always resist, 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 resist. And I'm now going to read to you the poem that I did. And those of you who would get the book, you will note that there's no S on haiku, always the English professor, but it's 6 haiku, singular and plural, no S. So this is called 6 haiku for our Pan-African women. 1, Black women discovering rainbows in our sleeves. African women polishing our children's skeletons. Brown women celebrating life with gifts of prayers. Amen, amen, a woman, a woman, a woman, a woman, a woman. Spiritual women, festivals of morning hymns. Yellow women, kissing our spines with blossoms. Your words carry the spirit of creation. I say, your words, your words, your words, your words, carry the spirit of creation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, our dear sister Sonia. And right now,
Thank you.
I'd like to welcome Dr. Eleanor Baker Rogers and Fasaha Trayor, who have authored this much celebrated book that examines the lives of Black women who, for the most part, have been hidden figures in Philadelphia's history. And I guess my question would be for the both of you, what was the light bulb moment when you two decided to undertake the major task of researching the mostly unknown stories of Black women leadership in the city?
Okay, this this project actually began with my co-author, who I've always called Sissy, um, with a Black History Month project that she wanted to do that would focus on Black History Month heroes and sheroes that were not usually focused on. And of course, most of those were women. And now that she's here, I'll let her finish telling this story because it's really a story about how much has to really be unearthed in order for the stories of Black women to be told.
So I assume that we're telling the story of how we got to They Carried Us.
Yes.
They Carried Us really emerged from a fledgling social media project. I was new to Facebook. It was 2012, around Black History Month, and Women's History Month was going to be approaching in March. And I wanted to do something a little different in profiling heroes and heroines of Black history. So I decided to focus primarily and actually exclusively on Black women in the city of Philadelphia. What I learned from that project was that although to some of us here on the panel, these women were well known for the important work that they have done in the city of Philadelphia, they seem to be largely unknown to the audience who tuned into the social media project. And by unknown, I mean that the interest was extremely overwhelming. I had no idea that I would have hundreds of people coming to the site to read about these individual women. And in some cases, thousands of women, thousands of people tuning into the site to learn about these women. And so when you find yourself in a position like that, where you know that there's such an interest, you have to do something about it. And so that's something that I did, was putting a phone call to my colleague from the days of Philadelphia Citizens for Children and Youth, which is now known as Philadelphia Citizens. It's
Public citizen.
citizens, rather. Public Citizens for Children and Youth. I contacted Fasaha and asked her if she wanted to write a book with me. And so that's how we began. It's been, she likes to say, a 6-year journey. It probably was closer to a 7-year journey in terms of the beginning of our work and when the book was finally published. So that's how it began. And I'm not sure what else you want to add, Fasaha, to that?
Well, only that, as I like to tell people, if someone calls you up and says, hey, let's do a book, think about it. Don't just jump right in with both feet and say, you know what, we really do need to do that, don't we?
And I never
How long
tired.
of the process was it, and how difficult was it to not only find out the contributions of these women, but also their family backstories?
Well, let me jump in with that, because, you know, one of the things that you should know about the book is that the book consists of 2 types of women, actually. 4 women we called forerunners. In other words, women who are no longer with us, and contemporary women. And we dealt with both types of women differently. We did a lot of research, archival research, library research, etc., for the forerunners, but we did original interviews of all of the 49 contemporary women. So that is how we, you know, how we approached it.
Well, and I'll add that one of the things that was extremely important to us is that we wanted to try to have, try to gather, rather, for lack of a better word, a universal story across the women who we identified for the book. And by that, I mean, you know, you asked the question, even going back to their childhoods. You know, we developed an interview guide that we use where we followed that guide in our questioning of all of the contemporary women. We wanted to know where they came from. And in fact, you're in the book, and so I asked you those kind of questions as well. Where'd you come from? Where'd you grow up? What was your family like? What was your community like? What are some of the people who influenced you as you were an early child and as you moved through your youth and went off to work or went off to college or training or whatever it was? So we wanted to be able to understand what that looked like and felt like from the perspective of the women in the book.
Well, as it relates to the suffragette movement, while I believe that most of us were aware of the suffragette movement, but I think few knew the role that Black women played regarding the movement. In your minds, do you think that Black women were consciously erased from the telling of that story?
There's as a Black woman, and obviously as a researcher and a historian at this point, that is such a huge question. I think, in my opinion, I believe, not think, in my opinion, I believe that from our research, what I have learned is that Black women were second class. And because of their and our second class status, the suffragette movement saw us first as Negroes. There were definitely strong collaborations between the white women of the suffragette movement and Black women of the movement. But when tensions came, when it came down to who was going to get the vote, Black women were pushed aside in that regard. And if you look at the body of literature that's out there, you read about the backgrounds, what you hear about are the stories of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other women, Lucretia Mott, and Alice Paul, and those were all white women. You have to take another dive in to hear the names of many of the Black women who we've included as forerunners in our book. Certainly names like Sojourner Truth, you hear about. But when you think of suffragists, folks initially think of white women and the white women who led that movement, and not brown-skinned women, Black women like us.
And that's really, a lot of that has to do with the fact that Black people, not just Black women, but Black people were stigmatized. I mean, many of the white women of the suffragist movement really, in some cases, they were like, these Black guys are gonna get the vote before me. In other words, many of them were really, they were promoting the idea that their whiteness should have taken precedence over the idea of human equality, over the idea of universal suffrage. And so I think that the stigmatization of Black people is really what accounts for the way that Black women were treated, both within the suffragist movement, and I think it accounts for the divisions that ultimately occurred within the suffragist movement. And it also accounts for the fact that up until probably a couple, maybe a decade or two ago, the idea that women earned the right to vote by the 19th Amendment was thought to be a universal idea, even though everyone knows that Black people didn't get the right to vote until 1965.
Right.
So,
right.
So that stigmatization is, I think, accounts for a lot.
And a different way to think of that stigmatization is to think of equality. Okay, and so for for us to have achieved that accomplishment or those rights, we would have to have been viewed as equal to whites, not just in the suffragist movement, but in the abolitionist movements as well. So, you know, that's, were we erased? Yeah, I believe so.
Well, also, would you help us to understand the relationship between the suffragette movement, the abolition movement, Philadelphia as a major Underground Railroad destination, and also Philadelphia's mixture of enslaved Blacks and free Blacks?
I think that this is one of the things that is the least well understood by many people. And because the abolitionist movement was really where women in general cut their teeth on public roles. I mean, most women were not really women, both white women and Black women, were not supposed to be speaking publicly about anything. And so the abolitionist movement really became the platform that really gave people like Grace Bustill Douglas, Sarah Mapps Douglas, all the three Fortin women, Fortin
Yeah.
women.
Yeah.
It gave them the opportunity to both articulate their views, to engage with, you know, other public figures, and to really learn how to be public personalities. And so I think that the abolitionist movement, it has really not gotten its proper credit for the launching pad of the suffragist movement.
Yes, yes, the abolitionist movement definitely was a launching pad. And in fact, you know, many of the suffragists or folks who were, you know, pushing for the right to vote for Black men and women, universal suffrage I'm speaking of in that context, you know, they cut their teeth in terms of learning how to lead a movement, how to engage people. They cut their teeth on in the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement was I think, you know, in part, if not in large part, you know, developed because, obviously because of, you know, the belief that that Blacks should, you know, should be free, and that slavery was this, you know, this horrible thing, but in terms of Christian, Protestant, you know, Baptist beliefs in what God would desire of all of us, you know, as people, that people should not be enslaved, okay, and that, so for me, my understanding of it stems from, you know, that belief as well. The conflicts, before I go there, you know, the abolitionist movement, not just the abolitionist movement was so important, you know, with its work with the Underground Railroad, you know, in Philadelphia, the fact that there were, you know, several stations, including the Fortune families was a station, certainly the Still families was a station, and those stations, or that work, allowed people like Harriet Tubman, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, you know, to find a place in the city of Philadelphia where they could learn to work, you know, as conductors on the Underground Railroad. You cannot separate out the Underground Railroad and that work, you know, from abolition or suffrage, I believe. And the reason that I say that is because, you know, the majority of the people, excluding white men, worked along all of those continuums. Would you agree with that, Fasaha?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you know, and I think one of the things that I think we have sort of come to understand through our work is that Black women have always from the time they got here, worked not just against slavery, but for human and civil rights. And that was a range of rights that most white women were not, even the white women who worked against slavery, who worked in the abolitionist movement, did not have an expansive vision of who should be an American and what rights an American should have. But that's what Black women brought to the struggle. They wanted equal education. They wanted, equal health care. They wanted not just the right to vote, but the right to preach. So these sorts of, this way of looking at what human and civil rights should attend to being an American, I think has been a real contribution that Black women have made to the idea of human and civil rights in this country.
And they believe that obtaining the vote would allow us to have those other
Yes.
rights that
Exactly.
that you're speaking of. There's one thing that I want to get in, because I really want to say this about those women of the 19th century. To borrow from the words of Shirley Chisholm, those women were unbought and unbossed. I mean, they were unafraid, and they had much to be afraid of. Okay, even though they were free Blacks living in the city of Philadelphia, free Black women living in the city of Philadelphia, if they were walking down the street in 1850, they could have been caught, snatched up by some renegade slave catcher, like Sarah Mapps Douglas almost was, as she was approaching her doorstep, in Center City. So they, even if they were free, or even if they were wealthy, and some of them were not, they, at any point, they were in danger. And so I think we ought to applaud them, for their fearlessness. She's muted.
Karen, you need to unmute yourself. Karen.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm okay now in terms of sound. I'm just wondering, who were the major Black women leaders in 18th and 19th century Philadelphia that we should truly hold up and make sure that our young people are aware of?
Well, for me, this is a say their names moment. Certainly the Bastille women, Grace Bastille, Gertrude Bastille, who's also known as Mrs. Nathan Moselle, Sarah Mapps Douglas, the Fortune women, who, Fasaha, you want to rattle their names off?
Yeah, the Charlotte Fortin, who was the mother of the wife of James Fortin, who was a wealthy shipbuilder. Her daughters, Margaretta Fortin, Harriet Fortin, and Sarah Fortin, they were all writers. They all wrote really voluminously about the need for freedom. They wrote for they wrote for various abolitionist, tracts and newspapers. They wrote poems. Harriet Fortin actually worked with her husband on something called the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, which was a committee of people who worked to help slaves escape. So this was a hellfire family. I mean, this family really, they were determined that they were going to do all that they could to help people of color, escape the bonds that they were in. So.
Yeah, and women like who was a journalist and a lecturer, you know, we should say her name. She was connected with the Underground Railroad and the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. Should definitely say her name. And frankly, we should say Harriet Tubman's name. She came to Philadelphia and cut her teeth on understanding how to become a conductor of the Underground Railroad. And there's one other name that I want to mention. And for some reason, I'm forgetting it right now. Caroline LeCount. I want to say her name. She was an educator, but she was a feisty woman who worked to make sure that blacks could ride on the streetcars. I think it's important to say her name, as well. I want to add something while Karen is muted. We're talking about suffrage, race, and power. However, in terms of, thinking about the work of Black women in the 19th century in Philadelphia, a lot of that work revolved around education and the, education through what they believed would lead to racial uplift. And, I think that their work was equally important, differently so, but, equally important. And that included Caroline LeCount and women like Cordelia Jennings Atwell as well.
Well, and it's very interesting because when we say that Black women were working across human and civil rights, the Fortin family and the Douglas family, Grace Bustill Douglas and her daughter Sarah Mapps Douglas, they established a school for their children. Why? Because of course Black children were not able to go to any of the privately held schools. So they established a school, and Sarah Mapps Douglas was its first teacher or perhaps principal. But Black women were working in all of these lanes. They were working on all of these lanes. Karen, can you hear us? You're muted.
You have to unmute yourself, Karen. Unmute.
Unmute.
We've lost her.
Uh-oh.
Sure that everybody.
Okay, there you go.
Yes, I don't know what happened. I just disappeared from the face of the computer. But we want to make sure that those people who have joined in to listen to this very interesting, compelling, and important conversation have the opportunity to ask our authors any questions that they have. And as we try to pull up those questions, I'm just wondering, who are our modern sojourners and Fannie Lou Hamers that you could identify today?
Okay, let me jump in with this. Well, certainly there are modern ones, and I think that we are not going to go very far before we start talking about the the work of people like, Marion Tasco and, people that we know today. But one of my very favorite people who worked on voting rights is someone that many people in Philadelphia probably have never heard of. Reverend Dr. Trayor Hall, who went south to be part of the Albany Project in the 1960s to help Black people gain the right to vote. Was in Selma during the whole Edmund Pettus Bridge thing. And finally she decided to go back to her first, well, she actually couldn't decide whether she wanted to be a lawyer or a preacher. And she, went to Princeton Theological Seminary and developed a whole level of, a whole philosophy, I guess you could call it, that she began developing in the South. And she decided that she wanted to preach against what she called bondage doctrine, that, that people should be free. And I just think that she is such an inspiration. And I hope that more people learn about her, that more people read her sermons and her speeches. In fact, she is a person that Martin Luther King said that he did not want to follow at the speaker's podium. So.
Yeah, that was what she referred to as freedom faith, I think.
Yeah, freedom faith. Yeah.
Could I just add that her church is located in the 1500 block of, maybe 1600 block of Girard Avenue, right across from what used to be St. Joseph's Hospital. And as North Philadelphia is becoming gentrified, that building is in danger of just becoming some grand or ungrand condominium. So one of the efforts I think maybe we could undertake is at least get a marker in terms of the Pennsylvania marker program under Dr. Bloxett to identify that house and the contributions of Reverend Dr. Trayor Hall. But I didn't want to interrupt.
No. I'm glad you did, because, and in fact, one of the things that's been such a delight about this book is that we mention people and people say things like, I live down the street from so-and-so, or I know that area of the city, or yes, I know that person. And that's really one of the great joys of this book.
It's almost 6 degrees of separation. We just don't know it.
Yeah. So many folks don't know that, and we're hearing it. I had hoped that would be one of the things that would resonate from the book when Fasaha and I were working with our editor. Let's mark where these people walked. Let's mark where they lived. Let's mark where they did a lot of their abolition, socialist, whatever kind of work that even the contemporaries did. Let's mark where they've been, so that people can see themselves in this book, in that way. We were talking about, the women, other women, current women who've worked on voting rights in Philadelphia, and I think we have to mention, as Fasaha did, Marion Tasco's name. Marion Tasco was the first Black woman to become city commissioner, and one of the first things she did was establish, that was back in 1983, I believe. And one of the first things she did was establish a collaboration with the School District of Philadelphia to institute voter education and registration in the high schools of Philadelphia. I think that was just a significantly important contribution that she made in that direction. So definitely want to mention.
Well, a lot of the questions are coming in from the people who have joined in this conversation. And one of the questions was, what is the last name of Reverend Dr. Prathia Hall is the last name. Also, we have a question from Brenda Robbins Wright. She would like the panelists to give us, or give the people that are tuning in, a list of the women whose names you have mentioned so far.
Oh, God.
And add to it.
Okay. Well,
like
you know, one of the, we could do that, but that would require typing into the chat. One way that you can get that information, I would say a really important way that you can get that information is to go to our website. What we have there at theycarriedus.org, I put that website in the chat, www.theycarriedus.org. We have a slideshow on our homepage of all of the forerunners. Okay, and you could click on any of those images and get those women's names. That's one way that you can do it. We also have on our website photographs of all of the contemporary women. So if you go to our website, you'll see the names, you know, of all of these women. I won't even, you know, I could type them all in the chat, but boy, you know,
It's a lot.
it's a lot. It's a lot, and I wouldn't want it to get lost in that way. You know, you could certainly also, I'll put my email in the chat. If that person who asked that question wants that list, they could email me as well. But you know, start with our website and see what you can find. I'll put my email in the chat though.
Well, I think in one of our, Ms. Sturdivant made the comment that there are many Fannie Lou Hamer types in Philadelphia in our history, and we may not all know all of the names. I remember when I first became a reporter and I used to cover a lot of civil rights meetings and political meetings, there were a number of older women especially who maybe I didn't know their first names or maybe their last names, but they were at every meeting. And these were people that made it on the bus or the trolley to get to those meetings. And a lot of those people were unnamed, and I don't think they have been celebrated enough. And maybe one of the things we could do is to do some kind of tribute to both the named and unnamed women who have been part of this struggle, because I don't think that people necessarily were involved in one part of the struggle. They picked up whatever had to happen in terms, whether it was political, whether it was about education, whether it was about voting, they were part of it. And so I think in some way, we need to find a way to hold up the huge, huge numbers of Black women that have contributed to our struggle. And as you've indicated in this book, carried us and continue to carry us under much more difficult times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even though these times are very difficult.
I mean, you're talking about women like
I believe Linda Richardson has placed a call, and she's saying that she wants her family remembered, because I mean, you have almost 3 generations in the Richardson family who have been in the forefront of just about every kind of struggle that Philadelphians have taken part in.
Mm-hmm. Let me just say that you're speaking about women like Maddie Humphrey, women like Carolyn Davenport Moore, you know, certainly women like Roxanne Jones. You know, these women really worked hard to, you know, really make the lives of Black Philadelphians, you know, more equal, more better, to get them services. And so there's definitely a long list. And we included, as much as we can do. There are this book, not just 95 women in the book, but 600 some odd pages. And people have said to us, oh, you need to do a volume 2, or, you know, and we're still reeling in for volume 1, but we'll see what happens. But certainly I agree with you, Karen.
Yeah, to Linda Richardson's family, her mother, an important figure in Philadelphia, her daughter, an important figure in Philadelphia, and Linda herself, an important figure in Philadelphia. So when you talk about 3 generations of women who did various kinds of things, you know, I think that the issue of I think that certainly Linda and her daughter, the idea of trying to garner resources for our community, which is, you know, really, I mean, this is a perpetual problem, a perpetual issue, and this is something that they've been working on forever. Um, and of course, Linda is now working to rehab the Uptown Theater, which, you know, is close to my heart. Um, and I just think that, you know, people need to understand that these sort of um, institutional bulwarks to our community are very, very important, as important as voting. You know, people have to have ways um, of relating to society, and you do that through institutions. And so the people who have worked to create and sustain the institutions of the Black community are really, really important.
Fasaha, can you talk real quickly about Crystal Bird Fawcett?
Oh, Crystal Bird Fawcett, first of all, she was the first Black woman to be elected to a state legislature from anywhere in the country. She lived in West Philly. She started, she helped to start an institute at Swarthmore College, the Institute for Race Relations at Swarthmore College, and which was where she met Eleanor Roosevelt. And they had a friendship for quite some time, although the friendship frayed because Southern Democrats did not want to allow her to do the kinds of things that she wanted to do, which was to try to create better bonds between Black and white women. And the Southern Dixiecrats, they were just not having it. So she eventually left the Democratic Party, but she was a very, very important figure and worked really hard with the Roosevelt administration to, on a whole level, all kinds of things. So yeah, Crystal Bird Fawcett is a name that we really should lift up and remember.
I think a question that I think we should ask of our authors, but also of our Philadelphia School District. Has the school district indicated that it will use your book as part of historical curriculum, especially as it relates to Black history? And I'm also wondering if the book is included in any of our area universities' women's studies or Black studies curriculums.
Yeah, let me take that question. We have already begun we're in the planning phase with the social studies specialist of the School District of Philadelphia, uh, and also in the planning phase of working with Teach for America Philadelphia Collective as well. What we're doing at first is focus groups with several teachers, small groups of teachers, to understand how they would like to see what they think are the best strategies for integrating. They carried us into social studies, world history, uh, classes for middle school and high school students. So that planning work has already begun. And obviously we'll be reaching back out to them, the school district, to purchase books. And if need be, we will be embarking on fundraising, possibly, reaching out to corporations for sponsorship as well. But to answer that question, we are definitely in the planning phases with the school district to do that kind of work. That's the first phase of our educational approach. The next phase would be to move to area universities to look at, as you said, using the text in some of their courses beginning the spring semester. Fasaha and I have been invited, or rather, I'm going to use that word nicely. We'll be speaking at a conference in October, the Black Doctoral Network, and that will give us an opportunity to talk to graduate and doctoral level students, as well as faculty from regional colleges and universities. So we're beginning that work.
I think it's
To
also
interject,
interesting
oh,
to look to the issue of how so many of the Black leaders, both in the past and today, are interconnected. That when you start mentioning one name, then you can speak to 3 different ways or 4 different ways or 5 different ways that they're connected through organizations, through churches, through communities, through neighborhoods.
Yeah,
And
I
so
think that
it
goes
was
to
not just one group.
absolutely, and I think that goes to the question that someone, I believe it's Denise Rodriguez, has in the chat, and she's asking what actions can be done more effectively to help women of color to follow the legacy of the great women of the past and occupy places of power and leadership positions to influence the social change we need in Philadelphia today. That's a great question. And I think that part of how we can begin the introductory process, because I think that's what it is, of getting to know who these women are is, invite us to have book club meetings, invite us to, have virtual community level events. We are definitely open to doing that. And those kinds of conversations, can be more targeted. There are 9 content chapters and they carried us, and we could address or focus on as narrowly or as broadly as any folks in the audience want to do, examinations where we talk about, where we have discussions of who these women are and the work that they have done. We definitely are open to doing that.
And of course, we can't have a conversation about Black women's leadership in Philadelphia without talking about Dr. Sadie Alexander, who received the first PhD in economics in America, I believe, first woman. And her story is not just one of academic achievement, but also a story where her office was actually in North Philadelphia, not too far from where I am. And her daughter, Ray Pace Alexander, was telling me that in the evening, both her and her father, her mother and her father, actually had community folks come in and they handled their legal issues. Mm-hmm. So on one hand, they were downtown doing the people's business, but they were also in North Philly doing the people's business. And so I think that it's important to note that the women that we're celebrating, that are celebrated in this book, are just not the people with the titles and the degrees and the recognition. They're often people that didn't have the recognition, but in a way were connected on so many different levels. And even the people that had the degrees and were recognized, they were there for their community. They weren't above their community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when you say that, it makes me think of Reverend Olivia Stewart Henry, who was a teacher in North Philadelphia around 23rd and Berks. And she led a boycott to, get the store owners on Ridge Avenue to start employing Blacks. People may not know her name, but there are definitely those kinds of contributions, a number of significant contributions like that. Medical, physicians who worked in the communities, that Black women, and
back to Sadie, one of the things that Sadie recommended back in, and this was in like the early 1940s, she continued to exhort people to go into government. Now, we think of Black political power, et cetera, et cetera. We think of that as from 1970 on. But this is what Sadie was talking about back in the early 40s, that Black people had to go into government if they were going to try to, have a positive impact on their communities. And so, I think that some of what many of these women were about has really only now come to pass, okay? Has really only now become like a part of our daily lives. But it was something that they were calling for very, very early on. One thing that I want to say, and we usually try to make this statement whenever we're talking about the women of this book, is that there are as many women not in this book who should be in it as there are women in the book. But as we say, 600 pages is kind of a lot. And
can you say volume 2?
yeah, that's everyone's solution to the problem. But I mean, there are so many women that we really could have and we wanted to have in this book. Lois Fernandez, C. Dolores Tucker, Amina Young. I mean, there are many, many, many.
Denise King.
Yes. No, Denise is in it.
Denise is in the book.
Yeah, Denise is in the book.
Yeah.
So there, we want people to know that no one should see this book as some kind of, encyclopedia of who's who among Black women in Philadelphia, because that's really not what it is. What it is.
Can I interrupt here and call it at least an introduction?
Okay. There you go. There you go.
Also, I also wanted to let you know, Karen, that Linda has joined us as a panelist. And for me to have two of my mentors on the same program, including you, Karen, and Linda, all at the same time, is an honor for me. It's a personal honor that two of the women who have been most impactful to me are in the book and are here with us today. So welcome, Linda.
Hey, Linda.
And I think
Linda.
Linda?
She has to unmute herself.
Yeah. Can I add something while she's working on unmuting herself? These Black women, who have largely been, unknown or unseen, they include women in the book like Lordleen Jones. If it were not for Lordleen Jones, our girls in our public schools would not be involved in sports. That is so huge because she stood up to take on school district and Title IX to make sure that girls had the opportunity to be involved in sports activities. And that trickled into the work that Tina Sloan Green and Alpha Alexander and Nikki Frank were doing over at Temple, as well in the athletic department to get girls and young women involved in sports. And also I want to mention Shirley Dennis, who, if it were not for her work around the practices of denying mortgages to Blacks, that we wouldn't be able to live in some of the neighborhoods that we do. Now, there are definitely neighborhoods where Blacks are excluded from, and they're excluded because they can't afford it. And that's due to gentrification, as Karen mentioned earlier. But, in terms of some of these early efforts that were made, early inroads that were made, these are women who are behind that work, that kind of work.
I think what it's also mentioned to bring the conversation all the way back to Sonia is that the women in your book and the sentiment that Sonia expressed is that we've never opened any doors by ourselves. Mm-hmm. We've always, it has been our MO to bring other women along with us, mm-hmm. beside us, behind us. Mm-hmm. And so that Philadelphia has this richness of Black women. That richness is that we've always, like I said, it's in our DNA, mm-hmm. to bring other women along with us.
And also, I think it's important to note that Black women leadership didn't represent a so-called elite sliver. In the suffragist movement, those women were considered elite. But the women that have provided leadership and continue to provide leadership in the city of Philadelphia that are Black are mothers, they're grandmothers, they're crossing guards, they're sometimes elected officials, they may be nurses, they may be nurses' aides, they're across the spectrum. But the one thing that unites them, they don't feel held back, and they will step forward to do what they can, whether it is organizing their block, organizing their larger community, or running for office, or being a teacher, or being a principal. So it is a much more inclusive group when you're really talking about Black women leadership in Philadelphia.
And on that note, I really want to note the passing of Nellie Reynolds. Because Nellie Reynolds is a woman that we wanted to have in the book, but our ability to interview her was just, we just were not able to get to that. But Nellie Reynolds is such an important figure in public housing in Philadelphia that more people need to know about. So I just want to raise the name of Nellie Reynolds.
I want to read, there's a question or a comment from Pearline Sturdivant, and she says that Reverend Henry was an outstanding woman. She was a White Williams Scholar alumni such as herself, and she says that she had the outstanding opportunity to speak to her during one of our events while sitting on the White Williams Alumni Committee. And she says that she told her that the true understanding comes when you travel the world. She reiterated that traveling is important and that individuals would not have a limited understanding of the human family. And I think that's very important because so many of us have come together when we go on trips, whether it's to Washington, whether it's to New York, whether it's to Ghana or whatever else. There's still a whole group of us, I think, still striving to understand ourselves, our history, and our culture. I think that's what kind of keeps us all together in a large group of women, that we're all striving to find out more about ourselves because so much has been hidden from us because of how our story has not been told.
Karen, that reminds me, hi, Linda.
Hi.
Hello there. Glad that you were able to get in.
Oh, thank you so much for facilitating that.
Sure. Let me just finish this real quickly and say, Karen, I want to tell you, the audience, that we're also at the very, very, very beginning of discussions with Jane Goldman and Mural Arts Project about possibly getting a mural, some kind of mural program dedicated to these women. And that, again, very early stages of those discussions, nonetheless happening.
Linda, tell us about your 3 generations.
Okay, so well, I think that there was a miscommunication. I think it may have been the person who called may have been from the family of Dave Richardson, but I will respond. Your comments about our family has been very, very important, and thank you so much. My mom started working with the Department of Education in Pennsylvania doing race and sex equity, and she did seminal work on educating principals on Title IX, and more importantly did an annual book on women in Pennsylvania history, which includes some of the women that you have profiled. In addition, you know, as you mentioned, I have been working on philanthropy, alternative philanthropy, and work around the restoration of the Uptown. And I'd love to be involved in the marker issue because I've been working with a couple of African-American women from North Philadelphia who are preserving some of the sites in the community. And finally, my daughter, who carries on the work of the tradition in our family, working on economic development and working to include the African American United Fund in the 21st century by continuing to garner resources for our community.
I just think that that's so important.
Yeah.
It's so important. And I, you know, I think just to sort of focus back in on Philadelphia, you know, Philadelphia has not done a very good job of lauding these women. I mean, you are always hearing about the city of brotherly love and sometimes sisterly affection. But the sisterly affection part rarely includes Black women. And yet the Black women of Philadelphia have really had a huge impact on Philadelphia and life in Philadelphia. And people in Philadelphia need to know that, whether you are Black, white, green, blue, or whatever. People need to understand the impact of Black women on this city.
Who was it in the book that, I think it was Carolyn Davenport Moore, led the NAACP?
Yes, yes.
Okay, but where I'm going with that is the Philadelphia transit system and getting, you know, Black men, you know, opportunities to become drivers. I mean, I was assuming that was a precursor to SEPTA.
Oh yes, it would. I mean, everybody in Philadelphia knows about the PTC strike. Now, the PTC strike was a strike of white guys who didn't want Black guys to be able to drive the trolley. And Carolyn Davenport Moore was a woman who led the NAACP and used the NAACP to have almost a year's worth of demonstration to insist that these jobs be open to Black people, and in that case, Black men. But we hear a lot about Cecil B. Moore, whom we should hear about, but Carolyn Davenport Moore, no relation, really was the person who turned the NAACP into a mass organization. So.
I don't want to overlook the medical community. We have someone like Dr. Helen Dickens, whose office was in North Philadelphia, I believe at 16th and Jefferson. And she was one of the early, if not the first Black woman to graduate with a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania. And it's interesting to note now when we see the low numbers of Black people, Black women, even in the nursing profession in Pennsylvania. I think the number of registered nurses of Black women is something like 4%. So on some levels, we've gained a lot, but I think we haven't necessarily paid enough attention to the education system that is not even gearing up and preparing our children to take on some of the important roles that some of our historic legacy women were able to take on because of the benefit of education. And I think that, you know, as women, we have to have more activism to make sure that our young people are getting the education that they need so that they can be the doctors, the lawyers, the nurses, the teachers, whatever, because we're talking about 1800s and 1900s with very little support, and all the contributions that Black women made during that time with little education, little support. And now we have so-called better education, and yet our children are not doing as well on so many levels. So I think that's a major issue that Black women have to kind of step up and give some indication to our school district that we want much more for our young Black women and Black girls also. We just got a note that says there's several questions in the Q&A, and will we be able to answer them? As I am looking at the chat, I think I've answered all that I see, but if there are more questions that come up, we're certainly willing to answer. I know our guests are our authors. And would you just go over some of the names of some of the women that you spotlight in the book that maybe people aren't necessarily that aware of, that, you know, they haven't been talked about much, but that you were able to find out their stories?
Well, you know, I really think that the best thing to do is to really go to our website, www.theycarrieduS.org, because there's something about all of the women in the book. There's pictures of all the contemporary women. And I think that that would really be, that's the easiest thing to do, because there are really so many people in this book that I'm sure that most people haven't heard of. Anyone from Black Alice, born in Philadelphia in 1694, all the way to Anne Apple, who was the first Black woman organist at St. Thomas's. And she died very young. I mean, there are just many, many people who, as I say to everyone who asks me, who is your favorite woman? And I usually say, whichever one I'm reading about. Okay, because they're just really all fantastic, fabulous women. And so we urge you.
Yeah, there was, you know, Dr. Rebecca J. Cole, who worked with Elizabeth Blackwell and her sisters, but you hear the names Elizabeth Blackwell as in the Elizabeth Blackwell Center, but you don't hear Dr. Rebecca J. Cole. She worked as a physician in North Philadelphia, you know, and as did Dr. Carolyn Still Wiley Anderson, who's on the spine of the book. She worked with her husband in building Korean Training Institute. You don't necessarily hear her name connected with that. And a lot of Philadelphians have come through Berean. So you go to our website. We really have tried to do a good job of not just listing those women, but showing you images of them as well.
What I would
And
like to
I have put my email address in the chat as well, if anyone wants to follow up with, you know, other questions related to, you know, who they are.
Thank you. What I would like to ask our authors today, considering that this is election season, and some people are calling this the most important election, at least in our lifetimes, I'd like to ask our panelists, who are the women in Philadelphia today that we should be looking to help us with getting out the vote under abnormal circumstances? I think we have not had the challenges we early on about suppression and the barriers, and that the suffrage movement in and of itself was access to the ballot. What can we do today to honor these women who fought for access to the ballot so that we can honor them come November?
I'm going to leave that question to Fasaha, and only because I haven't physically lived in Philadelphia for the past 7 years, and so I'm not quite sure who they are locally right now.
Well, you know, I think that there's, you know, that there are many women who are, you know, active in politics and in, you know, getting out the vote. You know, I am particularly, what should I say? I have a lot of respect for Sherelle Parker, especially in connection with her work on COVID-19 and making sure that Black people in Philadelphia are able to get tested. I think she's really done stupendous work on that. The newly elected people, Kendra Brooks, and others. I mean, I think that there's, you know, that there are women walking in the footsteps of people who have come before and who are doing, really working on this issue of making sure that the vote counts. I don't know, Linda, do you have some thoughts about any of this?
Well, there are some grassroots initiatives, and some of the grassroots initiatives are coming out of the COVID experiences with the group I'm really close to. Grants' parents, grandmothers, and grandfathers who are raising their grandchildren, and they've been doing since COVID both personal and community rallies for registering people to vote. And so they give out food every other Tuesday, and they do voter registration. So those women, besides the working with their grandchildren, raising them, which is a challenge in itself. As much as I love my grandchildren, I would be very challenged to do that kind of work, but they are doing it and doing the kind of social work that is really important.
Thank you.
We have a question. Susan Crosby is asking the question, how can white women allies amplify these stories and your work and share the book and the website? Question for our guests.
I really appreciate that question. I think that there are several levels of response, but certainly one is that as you hear of the accomplishments and achievements and the efforts and the work of Black women, and you find yourself in conversations with other people, talk to them about this, share that information, say, hey, I know that so-and-so, was involved in this work. And, it's important that you have those conversations. I think that's really important. The other thing is that, as I said, invite us to some forums. At this point, it's virtual, but we'd be more than happy to come out and, to show up virtually and have those kinds of conversations, with diverse audiences. I think one of the, I'm just going to go back to my first comment. I think one of the major things that happens time and time again is that as we learn about people, we need to be talking about them, talk them up. I think that's very important. So, have your thoughts?
I see some other questions in our Q&A feature. Looks like we have a question from Leslie asking, what recommendations do you have for others who inspire to write about Black history or Black women's history? And what are some of the personal sacrifices you guys have had to make to complete this book?
Well, let me start by saying the list would be too long to even get into. I mean, I think that, many of the things that people say about writing books, I'm sure that we ran into all of them, all of those sacrifices, family time, money time, whatever, whatever. It's no joke. It was no joke writing this book. It really wasn't.
In terms of the recommendations that we have for others who aspire to write about Black history or Black women's history, I think part of my recommendation is to take the time out to read first, to read and learn, and then join groups where there are budding authors. I know of a number of groups on Facebook and through other social media where budding authors are coming together to learn how to write a book. But I think that it definitely starts with learning what you don't know, and then it's time. Put the time in. If you want to write about Black history or Black women's history, as Fasaha is kind of saying, but dodging at the same time, it's a real commitment. It's a day-to-day commitment, to the grind of doing it. And I hope that partly answered your question. Of course, Leslie's my sister.
Yeah, I want to respond to one of the questions that came in the Q&A. which I think is a fabulous idea. Have you ever considered helping to curate a local or national exhibit based on your book? I love that idea. And I am, as soon as we finish, I am going to call up Diane Turner at the Bloxon Collection and talk about whether that can happen.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I think that that's a wonderful, wonderful idea. And I think that the Bloxon Collection has so many objects and artifacts and photographs that could, you know, contribute to something like that. That's something I'm going to follow up on.
I think it's also important to talk about the incredible artwork on the cover of your book by our dear friend and venerable artist, Barbara Bullock. How did that come about?
Oh my God, Barbara Bullock. Listen, Barbara. Barbara was, first of all, we were writing. We were not even thinking about the cover until we got to the end. And then we said, oh, we need a cover. And I think we were thinking that we were going to have photographs or something. But then we said, how could we put all these photographs on the cover of a book? And so, you know, talking about it, we said, we really need something symbolic. Okay, so as soon as you start talking symbolic, you're talking about artists. And so I called Barbara and I said, Barbara, listen, this is where we are and we really need something symbolic. And she said, well, of course, but I'm not gonna pick it out. You have to come over here and see what you want. So anyone who's ever been to Barbara's studio, you know that it's, as I tell people, when you go in there, it's the type of place that when you leave, you can only go to sleep. It is so mentally, I mean, it's just an amazing place, visually so stimulating that it tires you out. But she gave us several images, and we, you know, our editor and Sissy and I, we settled on this image, which we think, I mean, we just love it. We just love it. And love Barbara too.
Yeah.
Well, when you talk about intersection, Barbara was head of the art department at Elay Fay under the Arthur Hall Afro-American Dance Ensemble. So there are all these different intersections, whether it's art, whether it's sociology, whether it's education, whether it's politics, between, you know, this large grouping of Black women.
And let me just go to this Q&A, and that's connected. There's a comment in the Q&A that's related to a previous question someone had about how we effectively, no, that's not the question. Basically, how do we learn about these women? What Claudia Curry, who's also in the book, is saying in the Q&A is that Community College of Philadelphia now has an associate's degree Black Studies program. Please add us to the list of colleges that you will reach out to about the book. We'll do that. I wanted to just mention that. And then there's an important question here, and I'm not sure how much time we have, but here's a question I think it's really important by, how do we, if Emma Houghton asks, how do we effectively uphold the integrity of Black female leaders in the past and fight against stigma held against Black women in the present? That's like a discussion question in and of itself.
Yeah, that sounds like a question that Jovita, that the commission really needs to take up, because it's,
yes,
I think it's a very important question.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's an important question, and it's a big question. And we are, as we are want to do, we are over time, because, you know, we could have spent another hour in this discussion. And so at this point, I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I want to turn over the program to wrap us up to the chair of the Philadelphia Commission for Women, Vanessa Fields. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you. This has been such an incredible food for our souls this morning on this Women's Equality Day. I have just been, this has been incredible and very empowering. I'd like to acknowledge the many people who made this event possible. Many thanks to the legendary Sonia Sanchez for her powerful reading of the book's foreword. Thanks to the authors for this impactful book. I mean, you have given younger women, older women, all women, Black women, the feeling now that we really can do anything and that we really have come from women who are strong, and that, you know, no matter what's put in front of us, we can achieve. So special thanks to Dr. Eleanor M. Baker Rogers and Fasaha M. Trayor. Thank you, ladies. And many thanks to our moderator, the iconic Karen Warrington. I mean, I remember used to hear you on the radio and everything. This has been incredible. Special thanks to our planning sponsors, which is Women's Way, the Gender Justice Fund, the Johnson House Museum, Gwen McKinney, and the founding sisters of the Suffrage.Race.Power Civic Engagement Initiative. And lastly, a very special thank you to TD, our presenting sponsor for the past 4 years. And so I want to say for everyone, take care, stay safe, and have an empowering day. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Thank you.